All right, well, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us in today's NCPERS webinar entitled 2025 Public Pension Compensation Survey, Key Trends to Watch. I'm Hank Kim, an Executive Director of NCPERS, and acting as your host today. Today's session offers an early look at the findings from the 2025 Public Pension Compensation Survey conducted by NCPERS and CBIZ. This year's survey provides the most comprehensive view yet of compensation and benefits across the public pension industry, covering 90 positions, compensation philosophies, and oversight practices. With respondents managing over 6 trillion in assets and representing more than 25,000 members, this resource helps funds benchmark and strengthen their compensation strategies. We're joined today by four outstanding panelists. Our friends from our friends at CBIZ, Joe Rice, Managing Director, and Taylor Sprague, Consultant. From our fund membership side, Chris Bailey with the Teachers Retirement System of Texas, and Matt Eccles, NCPERS' own Associate Director of Research. They will share their insights from this year's survey, highlighting workforce trends shaping our industry and discuss compensation best practices. So with that, let me turn it over to Joe, Taylor, and Christine.
Thank you for that, Hank. We'll go ahead, jump right in. So as Hank was, Taylor, you can go ahead and keep advancing. So Joe Rice with the CBIZ team. So proud to be here with Taylor and Christine to cover the presentation. So I lead what we call our broad-based pay practice and our efforts within the public pension system. And it's been a great partnership with NCPERS the past few years to proceed with the survey. Good.
My name is Taylor Sprague. I'm a consultant on the team. Been working closely with NCPERS and Joe the past few years to put together this survey, handle a lot of the data analysis and report building, and happy to be here with you today.
Thank you. And I'm Chris Bailey. I'm the Director of Compensation and Workforce Analytics for TRS. We are a $225 billion fund, so we're on the larger end. I'm happy to be here to talk about compensation, and it's a little bit of my passion. I've been doing it for a while. I'm also on the faculty of World at Work, so I love this kind of stuff. So let's bring it on.
Well, just to give a little bit of background on CBIZ, if you're not familiar, we are a publicly traded company. We're approaching about $3 billion in revenue. We have offices across the country where we provide a wide range of services, as you can see, a lot in accounting and tax, and then, so about thirds, and then into consulting as well. The survey methodology starts with we have a partnership with NCPERS that we're in our second year now. We had both historically approached this independently with compensation surveys and then combined forces. And it's been a great partnership to really bring a lot more, a lot of data, really combining the best of both worlds from our respective surveys, and excited to share the results. So this does cover 90 positions that we see as common across most public pension funds. That's going to round out across the key functions that you're going to find. We also explore benefits data, looking at some of the oversight or governance, compensation philosophy, salary planning, and more. So we start this process by inviting over 600 public pension funds to participate in the survey. It's a voluntary process. We had the survey open for a few months, so April through July, and we're able to receive 169 respondents this year, which is great. So that's a new record for us. And we asked for a lot of different information. So we want to understand demographically things like assets under management, number of employees, number of members. And that's just to make sure that when we report the results, as we'll look in a little bit, we can segment that in a way that's going to be helpful to each of your funds. We're looking at governance and administrative practices as well, which can also be helpful for appropriate peer comparisons. Annual salary planning, so trying to understand what is considered in that annual salary planning process, budgets, how increases are allocated, Look at bonus practices as well. Compensation philosophy is a new one in this year's survey. And then we do some benefits prevalence data. And then again, compensation for those 90 positions. So who responded? We're really excited that our participant group, really spans a wide range of different public pension funds. And so you can see that there's over 4,800 systems that are administered through the respondents, representing about 25 million members, $6 trillion in assets under management. And then the chart on the right shows the breakout of, as we categorize under different assets under management tiers, we have a good participation level across the board. So I think regardless of where your fund might fit from size and scope, we're going to have good peer data for comparison. On this slide, we want to give a sample job and methodology. So in the published report, this is what you're going to see. So on the left there, we want to have a breakout of the overall number of organizations. So that's going to be the initial data set. You can see we're going to list the number of organizations, the number of incumbents. So that's how many employees are in that job that were matched to the position. And then we look at different percentiles for base salary and total cash compensation. We also break that out for those different assets under management tiers, number of employees, and number of members. So again, depending on your compensation philosophy and how you want to define your peer group, if you want to get specific about that, we have very good cuts of data within the published report to help you identify that. And then as Matt will cover later, there's also a dashboard provided through NCPERS where you can drill down even more and get pretty close to direct peer comparisons.
And I know when Joe and Taylor were asking me to help participate in this, they wanted kind of a little bit of a flavor for how different funds use this. And one of the specific questions was, how does TRS use data cuts, or what specific data cuts would we use from this survey? Just a little bit of background. We have about 1,300 employees, about 850 jobs. So clearly we're not going to get every single job off of every survey, and we use a mix of salary surveys to help fill that out. Our methodology is to use, we try to get 3 solid sources. So these are kind of those custom surveys, those kind of a little more ones that are niche related to certain jobs. And we would pull this in as well as data from other potential surveys we have, whether it's like a Mercer or Willis Towers Watson or Radford McLaughlin. TRS, we do our own survey annually for some positions that our board looks for. But what we would key in terms of data cuts clearly would be assets under management. We're going to go for the larger cuts because it's just not an apples to apples comparison with the smaller funds. As fabulous as they may be, it's just kind of a different, it's a different area. And we actually, a lot of people use organization weighted. We tend to go with incumbent weighted for a lot of our roles, just because we're trying to match to the labor market or where the prevalence of jobs are. And we tend to look at total cash versus just base, because we have a lot of positions that have bonus. There's a big difference in bonus eligibility. So when we would look at the data here, that's kind of how we would use this survey information in order to look at our positions.
That's great. Okay, so next we'll cover some of the key findings and trends. So on a positive note, we have we asked about recruitment and retention. And so we asked the question whether or not your fund is experiencing issues attracting and retaining skilled staff. And so in this year's survey, the highest response was 57% are reporting no problem. That has been moving in the positive direction, year over year. And within this survey, it represents a 8% increase over the year prior. And so it's a good trend. We're starting to see that things are normalizing and improving, but still at 57%, there's still a lot of issues or potential issues that might be on the horizon. We also ask about salary increase processes, as we mentioned. So as part of that, we asked what was last year's salary increase budget, and then what are you planning for next year's salary increase budget? So as we look last year and we report the average, it was 4.5%. And so that's a helpful way to potentially benchmark within your fund. If you were less than that 4.5%, you were behind the industry trend. And then as we forecast for next year, the reported average is 4.1%. So we are seeing a decrease. These numbers are still high from a pre-pandemic normal, but we are starting to see that year over year they're coming down and they are starting to moderate. We dig in on the annual salary review process just to understand how those salary increases are allocated. So some of the data there, we ask if merit is a part of that evaluation. And so 78% of the respondents do incorporate merit to some degree, 22% do not. And then COLA is also significantly a part of that. So it's 68%. That would indicate that there's a split approach where it's a hybrid. There is a certain level of COLA that would be received by all employees with then some additional compensation to be allocated based on merit. Want to highlight just some of the impact, especially over time, of annual salary range adjustments. And so each year we see that competitive salary levels for jobs increase due to inflation, wage inflation, supply and demand of job, annual salary increases. We see consistently that wages do increase annually. I have yet to see over my career that number goes down. So one of the best practices that we recommend is to adjust salary ranges annually to ensure that those minimums continue to stay competitive and those maximums stay appropriate. And so just to illustrate in the chart on the right, if we were to take a range with a fixed starting point of 70,000, and if you look at 2.5% movement compounded over those 3 years, you can start to see what that impact of compounding is going to be over time. So at that second adjustment year 3 mark, you're looking at a 5.1% movement. At that third year mark, it would be 7.7%. And so if you're in a position where you have salary ranges, but you do not adjust those annually, in pretty short order, those minimums are going to be less competitive in the market. They're going to start to be not appropriate. Those maximums are going to be set arbitrarily low. And especially with the wage growth that we've seen coming out of the pandemic, this is more important than it ever has been. Related to that process of salary movement, we wanted to take a look at one job from our survey going back from 2020 till now. So if we were to look at a benefits counselor, you can see on that chart on the right, that dark green section at the bottom represents the market spread from the 25th percentile of pay to the 50th or median pay. And then that lighter green is going to be the market 50th to the market 75th percentile. And when you look at that from 2020 to 2025, we see within our survey data that it has grown 5% annually. So in that chart where we talked about the structure update, that's 2.5%. The salary increases for this would be 5%. Which is pretty significant. And so if you were to compare the range from 2020 to 2025, as you can see in the chart, there's virtually no overlap. The 75th percentile pay then is going to be 25th percentile pay now. And so it really just highlights the importance of doing those annual adjustments, making sure that you're keeping up with market competitive salary increases. And this example was not cherry picked within our survey. We wanted to identify a job that, kind of entry level within an organization. And it's indicative of what we see broadly, where there's 4.9% compound annual growth rate of compensation within this pension survey. So we do provide annual salary recommendations as well, looking at this survey, but also looking at some broader governmental and labor market data as well. And so the recommendation that we have going into 2026 would be to update structures 2.6%. So that's your minimums, midpoints, maximums, again, just to make sure that those stay competitive. We're also looking at information from the Employment Cost Index. So if you're familiar with the Consumer Price Index from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, this is a similar metric also by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, but it's focused on wages only. So it's a great comparison for something like a structure update to see how wages have moved. There's other forecast data. World at Work probably has the largest participation for the survey of its kind on annual salary adjustments, but then also looking at some of those broader labor market trends like number of job openings, unemployment level, those type of things. And so really this is trying to track that broad measure of wage growth to just make sure that your structures stay competitive. So that's one annual recommendation. The other then is to make sure that employee salary increases are competitive with the market. So we're recommending 4% next year. So we're a little bit below what the pension industry is forecasting, but pretty close. The purpose of the annual salary increases is to recognize employee growth within the job. They've been employed in their role for another year. You want to make sure that they not just tread with that market trend, but they actually move through that market range as they have an additional year of experience and contribution. That's going to help avoid and alleviate pay compression. It's also going to keep their pay aligned with the market, as they continue to get more experience. And so these two things are really the core annual best practices that you can do to make sure that your comp study stays in line.
And at TRS, we do use that World at Work annual salary survey to not only age our market data, but to also give us an idea of what's happening on the salary increase side. You can drill down a variety of industries and geographic regions, but I also really like to see these other little touch points, like seeing what's happening in a particular, like in the public pension space, or what's happening in nonprofits or governmental entities. Now, we do not have a policy where we adjust our ranges annually, but what we do have is we essentially set our pay policy line to be that a job needs to be anchored to the market price for a position needs to be anchored to the midpoint of a range, and we try to get it no more than 5 or 10% off of market. So what happens is every once in a while, like last year, we made a broad adjustment to our salary ranges, but this year, as we're going through, we have the vast majority of our positions that are still in really competitive ranges. So they're still able to hit those competitive market targets, which I kind of consider that midpoint. But then the jobs that are no longer in that competitive range, we just take those and move them to a different salary group. So we kind of adjust some based upon what's happening. But either way, whether you adjust the structure and keep everybody the same, or you go and look at it position by position, definitely you have to make sure that your ranges and your positions move in order to accommodate it. And I definitely like to have some of this back pocket information because we have people who have high expectations about getting nice big increases every year. And it's good to know and to kind of help level set to say, this is what's happening in industry. This is where people are anticipating how much they're going to be giving in merit budgets. Right now, we're going into this year with a 5%, which we know is high compared to everyone else. And I've been telling executive leadership, keep in mind, like this is, if people are feeling like, why can't we have more? We need to be cognizant of the fact that we're already sitting in a really competitive space in that. So.
Yeah, that highlights a good point too, that these recommendations are really geared to kind of track those market trends, but it is important to understand how compensation looks internally, those employee demographics, where employees are within the range, and you may need to adjust, right? If you still have a lot of your population low within those ranges, you might need to overinvest to help kind of advance and get employees more to the midpoint of the ranges. Or if you see that employees are, nearing the top and you have market competitive ranges, you might want to slow down some of those increases. So that nuance is a best practice too. Okay, one of the things that we wanted to look at between this year's survey and last year's survey is just seeing how wages changed by function year over year. So when we focus on base salary, so overall, you can see that gray bar in the middle. So a little bit under 5% overall, but then there's some variability by department. Interestingly, you see functions like IT, benefits, investment, audit, and HR really leading the pack. So it'll be interesting to see if that's a trend that follows year over year, or if we see some movement where some of those kind of lower move up higher. Sometimes it's just churn with who participated and provided a match, and if an employee left and was replaced with someone lower, you're going to see some of that movement year to year. But it's just interesting to look at these trends. We also ask about bonus and short-term variable pay. So overall, we see that it remains uncommon among most public pension systems. Where we do see it offered, there is a clear trend that as the size of the fund increase, particularly measured by assets under management, you start to see that incentive compensation mostly within the investment team, but we do see that extend sometimes to that broader leadership team as well, where within the broader market, you're likely to see incentive compensation as a component of pay. So 57% of the funds with assets under management greater than 60 billion do offer bonuses, short-term incentive variable pay to some part of their employee population. Some of the big changes year over year when we drill in by job, it's kind of interesting. So when we look at the jobs with the largest increases, we're going to see a lot within the investment space. So director of real estate, private equity, portfolio manager, public equity, director of hedge funds, and then also the chief human resources officer. So it's interesting to see that one on here. Within the investment team, again, as you get into specific asset classes, we don't always have like the largest number of matches at each of these levels. And so we see some movement here and there, but probably no surprise. We see a lot within the investment team there. Some of the decreases, we see the chief diversity officer. That's a job that we have not had in our survey for, it's only been in there for a few years. And I suspect just as we've seen some pushback against DEI practices, some of those positions have been eliminated. We're just seeing those numbers move around a little bit. The actuary, if you notice year over year within the survey, it did move down pretty significantly, but that corresponded with a split. So we added additional actuary job levels. So as a participant, you can get more precise with your job matching. So you have more appropriate job levels to choose from. And so I think that's why we're seeing some of the movement within the actuary. And then some of the other ones, not necessarily significant, but just a little bit of movement year over year. We also ask for time in role as we collect this data. So for each position, we ask the participants to list how long the employee has been in that job. So the tenure overall we see is a little over 6 years. And then most of the functions kind of hover between that 5 to 7. And in that actuarial function, that's where we have the highest tenure overall, interestingly. So this is something that will be interesting for us to track over time and see what other additional trends we can pull out as we try to get more creative with evaluating the role of tenure. Compensation philosophy is the next section. So as I mentioned earlier, this is a new data point for us. And want to start by highlighting the importance of a compensation philosophy. So, as compensation consultants, we preach this a lot, but a compensation philosophy really sets the strategic foundation for how you want to approach paying employees based on goals, values, and market expectations. It's going to support those organization objectives. It provides a standardized framework for making pay decisions. And so as you might have board movement or leadership changes or employees asking questions about things, the compensation philosophy is that document that if you can hash that out, get it documented initially, it does serve as that, guiding principle for how decisions are going to be made. You may have an individual question and say, we think, you should look at comp this way, or you should take in that data point, or we should look at this fund, or like the broader industry. whatever it might be, you're going to be in a defensible position to say, we've thought through this. This is how we make pay decisions, and we document that within our compensation philosophy. So the questions that we asked were just initially, who has a compensation philosophy? So over 80% of the participants report having a formal compensation philosophy. And then within that, the majority target setting their pay at the market 50th percentile and anchoring that to base salary as opposed to total cash compensation. So you can see there's a little bit of a split within that green there. So 82% are going to use base pay. Total cash compensation is about 18%. And what that allows, as Christine was saying, is you can look at any impact that you're going to see from bonuses, variable pay, and how that might reflect in the data that you're making. You're anchoring your pay structure to that. So just to illustrate the difference between base salary and total cash compensation, we created this visual on the left where we tried to create a normal distribution of how you might see base pay distributed within the survey data. So that's going to be that blue bell curve. And then that green is going to represent total cash. And so as some funds might have some level of bonus or variable pay for the job, we see that pay distribution shift to the right. And so if you want to, most, as we saw, are going to anchor their pay structure to the market 50th percentile of base pay, right? That's where half pay more, half pay less within that blue line. You can say, even if you don't want to offer incentive compensation, to say, we want to be competitive with base and bonus. And so we're going to anchor our base pay structure to that market base and bonus data, right? And that's where you would bring in that total cash compensation philosophy approach. Certainly within that too, you could build bonus practices as a part of it, but we do see some funds that say it is not worth the member pushback and headline risk of having a bonus plan in place. But we want to be competitive from a pay standpoint with that. So it's a nice way to incorporate that.
I think you're muted, Christine.
I thought I unmuted. I was going to say that in terms of background on one of the reasons we did this, we have a large investment division that gets, they get a healthy incentive plan. And we also are in Austin, and we are in a really highly competitive job market. We completely redesigned our entire comp structure. We just started our 4th year. So we're still in the toddler years of our comp structure. But one of the things that kind of was the defining point was the fact that leadership and even responses from the board were exactly what Joe was saying, that they weren't really wanting to look at extending and creating a lot of bonus programs for positions outside of our investment division. But we saw enormous gaps. And it's something that I've been doing comp for a long time, but it used to be you could look at the difference between base and total cash for positions, and it was negligible. But what we started seeing with our IT positions were huge gaps where we couldn't even get close to offering. We weren't even close to offering what they were getting base. And when we redesigned our structure, we were able to adjust for it. So we have some positions where that total cash we have to drill into more because that's what the labor market is paying. And that's the only way for us to get those positions. But we also have vast majority. Like I can think of a lot of our benefits and our budget and a lot of, support positions and things where the difference between it is negligible. But it does give us that flexibility to see kind of where we're recruiting against.
Yeah. It's a good segue into our next section that I'll jump in here for the salary structure design, really 101 and kind of best practices that we see. And so the goal really of designing a salary structure is merging those external market factors with that internal equity considerations, right? And so when we evaluate market data, you might be wondering where do we kind of start? And so when we look at our reports and various other reports, like Chris mentioned, what do we do with the data that we evaluate? And so we're going to start with a few definitions here on this bell curve, but the 25th, 50th, and 75th percentile, you'll see in our report, you'll see in almost every salary survey report that you evaluate, is a distribution of percentile data points, right? And so that 25th percentile is the lower end of the spectrum on that bell curve chart there on the right, where 25% of organizations pay below that data point and 75% of organizations pay above. That market 50th percentiles, where half of organizations pay above that data point and half pay below. And the 75th percentiles, where only 25% of organizations pay above that data point and 75% pay below. And so what you get in that distribution, at least on this visual example, is the middle 50th percentile of the market from that 25th to 75th percentile. And so in our visual example here, we want to set our comparison point, which sort of ties into some of our conversations we've walked through today of where do we want to set that philosophy and that comparison point. And so you'll see our note here that our market comparison point is that 50th percentile, whether it's base salary or total cash. Kind of want to use that as our guiding point to design the structure. So next step of evaluating the data points and where our philosophy stands within it, kind of what is a benefit of designing this structure? And so it's going to help streamline the administration of the compensation system. One thing to note is whether we need one or multiple. And so some units within organizations will need different philosophies and different structures. Others may be able to encompass their strategies with one. So something to consider based on the departments and uniqueness of your organization. Your overall competitiveness will drive the salary structure design. So if we want to target a higher market placement than that of the 50th percentile, if you think of that middle 50th percentile on the chart we just looked at, those guardrails are going to increase a little bit slightly, right? So how we want to position ourselves is going to dictate sort of those guardrails for our minimums, our midpoints, and maximums. Again, it's going to consist of the integration of that external market data and those internal equity considerations. Some items may need to be thought of differently than others when we evaluate salary grades with positions, right? Our chart on the right just shows a pretty standard salary structure that creates a V-like visual, which I'll get to shortly. But each salary grade as we work our way up consists of a minimum, midpoint, and maximum. You'll see those little arrows on the bottom left of the chart for a midpoint differential and a range spread, which is really the calculation of the salary structure moving upward. And so the range spread is simply the increase of the maximum from the minimum as a percentage. The midpoint differential is the change in percent from midpoint to midpoint, grade to grade as you work your way up the salary structure. We have a final note there at the top too, is that midpoint is going to approximate that market comparison point of which you set that philosophy to when designing the salary structure as well. On this side, we just have a standard sample of what a pay structure would look like. Just working left to right, we have our salary grades, numbered 1 through 15. Sometimes this can be used as letters as well, but just a unique identifier to work your way up in salary grades from low to high, each consisting of a minimum, midpoint, and maximum with that percentage range spread and percentage midpoint differential. What you notice?
Oh, go ahead.
Thanks. Yep. As you notice, when we work our way up the organization in the salary structure, our range spreads and midpoint differentials increase, and the range spread a little bit more aggressively than the differential. The point of that is to really show the change in responsibilities, duties, and things that as you work your way up, it's just going to create a larger learning curve. We see that range spread increase in the market data as well. And so we want to expand that to accommodate the positions in the organization. And the midpoint differential is a similar dynamic when those duties, responsibilities increase as you work your way up in an organization. We just want to accommodate the increase as we kind of go from job to job across the organization.
And I was going to share that we have about, I think it's technically 25 pay grades, and we range from, on the low end, range spread 40%, on the high end, 60%. So it's kind of a little bit wider at the top than what's on this chart here. Our midpoint differentials start at about 8% and they go up to about 15%. And as I mentioned, we anchor our midpoint to the jobs market comparison. And the vast majority of our positions are on the same kind of salary structure, but we do have a handful, like a really small handful of people who are secundees to an office in London. So they sit on a different schedule. And then our executive director and chief investment officer, they kind of have their own little schedule. But we've been able to accommodate all of our positions using this type of structure.
So structure design and how wide we should make those ranges. So, I mentioned as we work our way up the organization, you'll see that range spread increase, but how do we know really where to start? What's the top end? And so that again comes from that market data. And so wider ranges, as Chris was mentioning, a little bit wider than the example before, they're going to give you a little bit more flexibility, right? But just mathematically, when you create wider ranges, your minimums are going to come down. So the wider you go, it will potentially come at the expense of a lower starting rate for jobs in those salary grades. On the opposite end, a narrower range in the kind of calculation of how these are designed will increase that minimum. So you'll create a more market competitive starting range for jobs within that salary grade, but it can cap those maximums kind of prematurely at that same cost. So on our visual on the right here, we have the blue chart from jobs 1 through 12, or blue graphs are going to be the 25th to 50th percentile per job. The green lines are going to be the 50th to 75th. And then we have a dark shaded gray there that kind of would give you an idea of what a standard range across the dispersion of these jobs would be. And very faintly, you can see a wider range that is a little bit wider than each of the blue and green bars on the left and right. So here's to show kind of what a really wide range would look like in a disbursement of data across these jobs. And we want to be somewhere in the middle to say as we work through different various jobs across the structure, where do we find that market comparison point in terms of being narrow enough to be competitive, but not too wide to where we're creating super low kind of starting rates, right? Next is how much overlap. So to those midpoint differentials, how close or narrow do we want to create those as we work our way up the salary structure to create a smooth ebb and flow of internal equity and pay progression? And so wider overlap is going to give you more flexibility to advance pay for jobs throughout the salary structure, but it could come with some internal equity risk where we have various jobs of duties that are either very significant, that are only a grade or two different, or some that are not very significant, that are in the same grade, but a large pay difference, right? The narrow range overlap could create some pay progression where the cap is super low in terms of jobs within the ranges. And so it can also create that internal pay compression where if we do make grade adjustments for positions, it might not be significant enough to alleviate any of that compression as we kind of advance the system over time. We have a slide for questions here, but I think we can put those in the chat or hold them until the end, and we're going to pivot to the dashboard within the NCPERS team.
Great. Thank you, Taylor, Chris, and Joe. Matt?
Thank you very much, Hank. All right, give me just a moment. I will get my screen shared here. And I'm just going to take a few minutes to introduce the dashboard that we have associated with this study that will allow participants to dig into a little bit more fine-grained detail and kind of find peer institutions against which they can benchmark their own compensation practices. Keeping an eye on the questions, I see that there are, a few folks who are, for example, interested in how to get a better sense of how some of these metrics break down by, for example, assets under management or the size of the plan overall. This dashboard can be a really useful resource for accomplishing precisely that. So it's a fairly robust tool, but just want to take a few minutes to introduce some of its features to you all. So we'll start here for anyone who has access to the dashboard, and that is done by either having participated as an organization in the study yourself, or you are also able to purchase access to the dashboard along with the study results. And folks who are NCPER, organizations who are NCPERS members get a discount there. So we have an executive summary that kind of opens up the dashboard that gives an overview of the study and a sense of the objectives and something about who responded and that sort of thing. And then if we can see up along the top here, both this set of buttons off of the executive summary, as well as this set of tabs up top, which remain stable no matter where in the dashboard you are. We have a set of pages that you can take a look at that will give you a more detailed breakdown. So for example, if we take a look at our first tab here, the Who Responded tab, here we have a number of KPIs across the top. For example, full-time employee positions, investment staff positions, how many active and retired individuals these plans serve, etc. And we can take a look at a few of the major compensation related variables that we have, or that rather that plan related variables that tell you something about who responded to this study. So for example, we can look at the types of employees and or beneficiaries that are served by our responding plans. We can take a look at the breakdown of actuarial assets. We can take a look at how oversight responsibilities between the plan and the sponsor break down. And where this is really powerful and where this is a little bit different than just a static chart in a report or on a website is that we can then break these down by, for example, multiple different states. Select just a handful of them there, and then we would click apply. And we can see that the dashboard automatically updates to give you the breakdown of these key variables and KPIs across the top for those states. We can do the same for a number of relevant variables along the side here. It's these filters that I think really give this dashboard its principal functionality. So for example, we can take a look at any plans that are serving county level employees in addition to others, for example. Or we can break things down by different actuarial assets. And we can see that we get a different breakdown there. So I encourage anyone with access to the dashboard to really spend some time diving in here and taking a look at the various filters that are available. In addition to who responded, we get a little bit further into kind of the meat of things with the compensation overview itself. We can take a look at each of the 90 positions that the report this year outlines. And we can see both their average salary and average bonus, as well as median salary and median bonus. So here, if you're trying to get a sense of, okay, for a peer institution, for a similar type of plan as the one that I'm associated with, how do folks think about compensation for a benefits manager? How do folks think about compensation for an actuary? You can take a look at the entire panoply of roles here, and you'll take a look. We can see both their mean and median salary, as well as the mean and median bonus associated with that role. So for example, you can see for most of the roles that are in the investment category, we have both data on salary and on bonuses. So you can see how that's kind of broken down. And just like with the Who Responded page, we could break that down, for example, by a series of states. to get a sense of what these roles look like and what the compensation trends and practices look like for these roles in those particular geographies or in those particular types of plans. We can also, for example, take a look at a particular job category. If we were going to take a look, for example, just at the investment side of things, if you didn't want to take a look at all 90 positions that we looked at here, we can break it down by just investment or by just finance or by just administration, for example. In addition, we have a benefits overview page, which takes a look at how many organizations offer, for example, traditional health plans, offer dental benefits, offer life insurance, parking, offer remote work, particularly in the years since COVID. Remote work does seem to be a practice that is, at least in part, here to stay. The majority of our respondents do offer some degree of remote or flexible work, but we can also break that down and take a look at how many days in the office are typical for the plans that do allow for some remote work. We can also take a look at trends in self-reported and self-evaluated ability to attract and retain staff, right? Plans that suggest that this remains a significant problem or is becoming a problem, as opposed to plans that don't have as much of a problem with that. And that is a metric that has been moving a little bit over the years in ways that are consistent with the broader labor market. And we definitely see that reflected in the survey. We can also see how things break down, for example, by role level details. Once again, we can see average salary and median salary and average bonus and median bonus for particular roles. But in this case, you can also see how that breaks down by, for example, assets under management. You can see how that breaks down in the bottom here by both assets under management and by years incumbent. So if you're trying to get a sense of not just what the sort of salary ranges and means and medians might look like, but how that is impacted by years incumbent for particular roles, that would be something that you can take a look at here. And just like all of the other pages, you have a long set of options here to filter the data to best reflect your own situation. And then finally, we can take a look at the last page here on job descriptions. If you're interested in how we defined and parsed out all 90 of these roles and what, for example, a senior actuary versus an actuary is counted as, we have fairly detailed descriptions of the scope and nature of the work associated with each role. Now, these aren't necessarily job descriptions that are meant to mirror the kinds of job descriptions that you would in detail write up for, you know, if you're interested in finding candidates for a role. But they do represent a very basic enumeration of roles and responsibilities, and they should tell you something about how we as researchers were able to kind of, or made the decisions to kind of parse out those roles. So this was a pretty short introduction to what I think is a really robust tool, and one that I know over the years our participating organizations have really appreciated as a way to really dig into the meat of the data that we have gathered here. So with that, I will pass things back to Hank, and hopefully we'll have time for a few questions.
Yes, thank you, Matt. We have 10 minutes for questions, and I know there are a number of questions in the queue. Just to finish up on Matt's presentation about the dashboard, along with the dashboard, Matt did record a short tutorial. It's about a 4-minute video outlining how to navigate and use the filter. So you know, I think that would be a great resource to use before you start, or maybe as a refresher if you haven't been to the dashboard in a bit. So let's start with the questions that have been asked. So first is, how do you view data where a large system has a lower salary listed for 50th percentile than a smaller system? So I will, Joe, it seems like you want to take a crack at that question.
Yeah, I'll take a crack. I mean, I think it's really a reflection of the different compensation philosophies that we might see, the frequency at which pay is benchmarked in set. So you're going to see some variability there. Now, when we talk about size of fund, we see that size is most correlated with pay for the senior level positions, where there is a strong correlation between size and pay. But even there, I mean, we work with funds and they want to be competitive with their top leadership positions. They don't want to exist in an ecosystem where it's just, they're going to move up the asset management chain to get additional compensation. If they want to hold and retain a key person, then they can identify and benchmark to some of those larger funds to make sure that they're setting pay appropriately. And so we do see some of that sometimes. And then certainly from a staff level, there's less of an impact on size. It just tends to be that a larger fund might pay, have more in a particular position. They don't necessarily pay them a multiple more. And so you're going to see that pay is often a little bit closer, but that's why it's helpful to look at those different demographic factors to identify what is the relationship between those different factors and pay for each position.
Thanks, Joe. Chris, did you want to add? Do you have any color that you want to add to that?
Well, I would probably say, and I think Joe kind of referenced it earlier, that, just the difference in the number of who's participating. You might have different groups in one who are now showing up in the data that weren't there before. But I think what may also be happening is how people level, how many levels they have in their organization and what they compare it to. And I think when I think about smaller funds, they may have one level, and that might be something that tends to lean into more of a senior position, more experience, even when you're taking it out of management. They're kind of looking at that, whereas a larger fund may have the ability to hire more people at a little more intermediate or possibly lower level. And so you just might not be getting, you might be getting a group of people who, but not that true one-for-one match just because of the way it's set up. But I think it's anytime I see what appears to be an anomaly in the data, I always like to look at how does the whole series range? What's the progression? Does this trend seem to hold true across multiple jobs? That's where you have to just kind of do a little extra analytics on that.
Thanks, Chris. Yep, great suggestions. Next question. What steps did CBIZ take to ensure that enough respondents were received in a certain job category or plan size to result in the statistically meaningful results?
It really builds off of the response of the last question that Christine was talking about. One of the things that you'll see in the published report or in the dashboard is that we do not list the results if there's fewer than 5 participants. And so we set that as a threshold. That's a generally recognized threshold. Now, is 5 data points really like a good realistic data point to make a compensation decision? We really like to see more than 5 to feel confident. And that's where, the all organization information might be helpful. That's where you're going to get the biggest level of participation. But it can be indicative, and you can see some trends. And as you get into those different data cuts to follow the relationship, but directly, we don't want to report results if there's fewer than 5. And I think it's up to the user or in consultation with a compensation consultant to identify what do we feel is really reliable, and are there additional surveys and labor markets we want to think about to make sure we have a broader snapshot of the market. So it's helpful, but it is some art into what you determine is really reliable for compensation setting.
Great, thanks, Joe. We have a couple of questions around the dashboard, and so let me take a crack at addressing these sort of dashboard related questions. So they center around how do I access it, who gets to access it. So just to repeat what Matt said, if you are an NCPERS member and you participated in the compensation survey, then you have access to the dashboard. That is one of the benefits of being an NCPERS member. If you did not participate and you are still an NCPERS member, and if you purchase the compensation survey, then you also purchase access to the dashboard. In terms of how to access the dashboard, you should have received an email earlier or last week where it gave you the link to download the PDF of the report, as well as a link to the dashboard. So look for the email that came from NCPERS Research, and there you will find the links to both download the PDF of the static report, as well as the link to and instructions on the dashboard. Great. Then another question: how do you account for or consider geography, higher cost of living areas?
That's a difficult one. There's not any, there is the ability within the dashboard to look at some levels of geography. It is important, and we do see that wages vary by labor markets. One of the things we're able to do as a consulting practice and some of the other data that we have access to is we can look at what are those geographic differences, how do wages respond based on the supply and demand of labor in each market, and make adjustments for that. So, I mean, especially if you are in some of those higher wage markets, it's definitely a best practice to make those adjustments to reflect the local cost of labor. Unfortunately, there's not great public sources to do that. So you could look at some of the cost of living indexes. Those tend to be more extreme than the wage variances, but it is indicative of, you know, the direction that things are moving for the most part. So it is a challenge, and unfortunately, there's not. Well, I don't know, Christine. You're in a labor market that is increasingly getting more competitive.
Yeah.
How have you handled that?
Well, I've just historically, anytime somebody talks about geographic differentials, there's no true method, like Joe said. There are places that have it really, to me, you always have to go back to your comp philosophy and you need to look at what cost of labor. There are some organizations where they may be in rural areas where the cost of living is incredibly low, but to get somebody to move out there, they have to pay them a lot. And conversely, you can have jobs and you can have positions, you know, historically, I'll tell you, like administrative support or security guards or some of our kind of that lower tier employees, the number of people in Austin are the supply of those positions is really high. And so they're not so much in demand. So the cost of labor is lower than it is for somebody who has some very niche or specialty ones. So the way we deal with it is we kind of lean into where are we recruiting from? Where is our competition for talent? And then we're trying to get salary data sources that hone in on that, because if you have good quality sources and you age your market data at an appropriate rate, you build in whatever those cost of living, you know, factors are, but you also recognize how much is it going to cost for you to hire, you know, a data engineer versus somebody in the printer mail room.
Great, thanks, Chris. We have reached our time. Apologies if we did not get to your questions. What we can do is try to answer them by email and get them to you. But let me end by thanking our wonderful panelists, Joe Rice, Taylor Sprague, Chris Bailey, and Matt Eckel for providing your insights and your expertise over the past hour. I want to thank all of you for attending and encourage you to register for our next webinar, which will be held on November 13th, entitled, "Is Your Plan Ready to Meet the Website accessibility compliance deadline. So another very topical and interesting issue coming up. Thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your afternoon, and we will see you next month. Thank you, everyone.
Take care.